Hi everyone, this is Martha Bailey at the University of Michigan. We're waiting just a few more minutes to welcome everyone to the keynote address by Matthias Doepke. So if you're logging on, just stay tight. We'll get started in just a few moments. So hello everybody, this is Martha Bailey. Welcome to H2D2 Research Day. We're waiting for everybody to get logged in, and we are going to get started in just a few minutes. So hold tight for Matthias Doepke's keynote address coming up in just a few moments. All right, everybody, it's 9:05, so I hope everybody's had a chance to get logged in. I know some people will continue to join us. Welcome to H2D2 Research Day. That stands for Human Capital, History, Demography, and Development. My name is Martha Bailey, and I am one of the faculty advisors of this program. Before getting started today, I wanted to acknowledge our sponsors, which are many for this program. The University of Michigan Office of Research, the Michigan Institute for Teaching and Research in Economics, Business Economics area at the Ross School of Business, the International Policy Center at the University of Michigan's Ford School of Public Policy, the Health Management and Policy Department at the School of Public Health here at the University of Michigan, the Economics Department at the University of Michigan, the Population Study Center at the Institute of Social Research, and the Rackham Graduate School on Interdisciplinary Workshops, which not only sponsors this event, but our weekly workshops in the Department of Economics. I'd also like to acknowledge what a terrific program that the student organizers have put together this year. They've worked really hard at reviewing a lot of papers. We had a lot of submissions, putting together really coherent sessions. And also, when we realized that the conference would go virtual, have worked tirelessly this week to make this process seamless. So I'd like to acknowledge Stephanie Carroll, Theo, I'm sorry in advance, Theo, I always get your name wrong, Kulzicki, Tyler Radler, Teresa Renosova, and John Denton Snyder, all of whom are graduate students, PhD students in economics at the University of Michigan, who have put all of this together. I'd also like to acknowledge the other faculty advisors. So Martha Bailey, that's who I am, Lauren Falco-Bergquist, Sarah Miller, and Anna Reynoso. We're very excited to welcome you today. I'm going to go through just a few steps now about how to schedule and how to join this program, which things are a little bit different than they usually are because everything's virtual. So the H2D2 schedule is posted at the link on our website. Presumably you found that link if you've logged in now. But if you want to join other sessions besides the keynote, say you just got the link to this one, you can navigate back to our conference and to the schedule, and you can find links like the one I show at the bottom of the screen. If you click on the Prime Times Blue Jean link, so for instance, you've already clicked on it if you've joined us here today, but you can click on lots of other events during the day too to join those sessions. You can participate in those. And just to let you know a little bit more about how to participate, all attendees except, so this is a little bit different than the typical meeting that Blue Jeans or Zoom might host. The default here is that all attendees except the speaker and moderator are muted so that people's phones and other background interference won't get in the way of the talks. So this is a little bit different, and we did this because we're expecting volume today, and we knew that things could get tricky asking that many people to mute. So each presenter in the normal sessions will have 15 minutes, and at the end we'll reserve 5 minutes for a Q&A session. During a presenter's talk, if you have a clarifying question or something is confusing, please use the raise your hand feature. You can see this on the right of your screen, the little hand, and that will, if you do that, you can signal to one of the moderators that you have a clarifying question. Also, there's going to be a Q&A session at the end, and if you'd like to participate in this, this is not going to be a free-for-all where everyone jumps in, but you're going to type your questions into the chat, which is the Q&A at the bottom. The session chair or moderator will then aggregate questions or ask them one by one if none of them are the same to the speaker. So make sure to type your questions in that chat at the end of your sessions. To clarify, our keynote this morning is going to be 1 hour long of Matthias talking. So if you have clarifying questions during that 1 hour segment, please raise your hand. And if you have questions and answer, we'll also have a question and answer session at the end that will be 20 minutes. And so we're planning to also use the chat feature for that. Also, if you have any other questions that you'd like to ask the moderators, you can use the chat feature if you're having technical difficulties at any point in the day, and they're all, they should be able to help you fix that or figure out how to participate. The other thing I'd like to stress, and one of the hardest things to do virtually is the poster session for the students. So one of the things that our organizers decided to do is collect posters and post them online, and presenters have also submitted short videos about them to give you kind of their short pitch. So this is kind of fun for them, and also fun for, I hope, many of our faculty and other students to view, and they'd very much welcome your feedback. So please take a moment to visit our website today and give some of these students feedback on their poster sessions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now, Matthias, and you can go ahead and get yours shared. And so without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Matthias Doepke, who, so he's right there. You can see him in the screen, and he's going to share his slides with everybody in just a moment. Currently, he's the HSBC Research Professor at the Department of Economics at Northwestern University, and every year we choose a keynote speaker who embodies the spirit of H2D2. That is, their research spans multiple fields. So for Matthias Doepke, some of his earliest work was bringing the methods of macro to the field of demography, which got me very interested in the things he was doing. And he's continued with cross-cutting work, more recently focusing on a lot of early childhood. In particular, his most recent book, Love, Money, Parenting, How Economics Explains the Way We Raise Our Children, has been acclaimed in multiple fields, both in economics and outside. So without further ado, we'd love to welcome Matthias Doepke to give our keynote at this year's H2D2 conference. So Matthias, virtual applause, everybody's applauding. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Martha. Thank you, everybody. It's great to be at this conference. As we all know, it's trying times. Our thoughts are with our friends in Italy and other places that are highly affected. But I think even though I would be very much enjoying being together with you right now, I think it's also inspiring to see the reactions we see, maybe not at all levels of government, but certainly locally and also in our academic community, how we react to this change. And being able to do this conference virtually in just a few days of preparation, I think is quite inspiring. And so I'm glad we'll be able to do this. And we'll probably learn something from this about how to make some of our future conferences more inclusive. Nevertheless, I do look forward to seeing many of you at actual conferences in the near future, hopefully. Let me ask one quick question. Can you guys see my mouse, or is that invisible when I move this around?
Yes, Matthias, we can see your mouse.
Okay, good. Just to make sure I can point at things later. Okay, so let me talk about this paper to you. This is a paper about the economics of parenting. It's joined with my ever-growing group of Italian co-authors. Fabrizio Zilibotti is my long-term cooperator. Then Francesco Agostinelli and Giuseppe Sorrenti joined this a little bit more recently. So this is a paper on the economics of parenting. And as Martha already pointed out, we have a recent book with Fabrizio on the economics of parenting. Now, this book we have written is essentially trying to use economic thinking to understand what parents do. So we think about parents' actions in the usual economic way of parents having objectives, such as liking their children and wanting them to do well, and then choosing their actions in an optimal way given the constraints they face from the economic environment. And so in this book, we argue that a lot of what we observe about how parents behave, from fertility, but also parenting style and the intensity of parenting, how much time you spend on parenting in general, that these can be explained quite well with economic factors. Now, in the book that we have written, the perspective that we take is that parents can actually influence children. And so the idea is that there are certain things parents can do that will have some direct impact on what these kids will be like and what actions they take. You're able to shape their preferences, maybe have some influence on their actions. The model in the book is one where kids actually kind of look up in some way to their parents and take them seriously. And if you have little kids, like little toddlers, that's actually quite true. Little kids do like you a lot as if you're the parent, and they are kind of impressed by what you have to say, and they often, to some extent, try to follow what you have in mind. Turns out, however, that this model of children really take the parents seriously, that has a expiration date. As kids get older, at some point they start to maybe not listen as much anymore to their parents. There might be increasing conflict, and what we see is many forms of evidence on this, that as kids get older, become teenagers, become adolescents, the direct influence of the parents becomes much smaller, and the influence of peers becomes much more important. So teenagers are much more interested in what their peers think about them. They're much more interested in impressing their peers as opposed to listening to their parents or trying to impress them. And those of us who have kids in this age, have seen this play out in real time. I think many can relate to this. Now, this might suggest that once the kids are teenagers, that parenting doesn't matter anymore. But of course, that's not quite true, because there's still something parents can do, namely they can try to shape who that peer group is. And so what this paper argues is that when we think about parenting in the teenage and adolescent years, what is essential is maybe not so much the direct impact of parents, but what becomes more and more central is the impact of parents on peer groups. So if parents do something that matters, it is probably in this dimension. Now, how can parents do this? Well, there's a few different dimensions. So one important one is choice of a neighborhood or school. Often parents move to a particular neighborhood because they think it's a good place to raise children. and a good place to raise children. Often that means that you think in this neighborhood, the peers, the other kids, the other families will be, of a kind that you as a parent perhaps find more desirable than others. You can also choose activities, sports, music, to some extent, what activities you think are a good idea to pick up for kids when they're younger are also informed by what you think this implies for who the peers will be when they're older. And finally, there's also the possibility of directly intervening, of really trying to shape who your teenager can be friends with. Now, these are decisions that could in principle matter. What this paper is about this paper is about thinking of parenting from this dimension of parents trying to influence peer groups, and then seeing if the economic approach once again works well for understanding these choices. So the questions that we specifically want to address is, first of all, how do parents take those decisions? Are they doing this in a way that tries to influence their kids in a particular direction, or maybe are they not very strategic about this at all? The second question is, how do these interventions in peer groups interact with other parenting choices? Now, we know now from large literature that investments in skills are quite important and have some economic basis. From our earlier work, we see that parenting style can be explained with economic factors. Do these other dimensions of parenting interact with these interventions in peer groups? And then finally, all this analysis leads to a policy question, namely whether there are important interactions of parents' interventions in peer groups with other policies that are also aimed at shaping kids' peer groups. If you think about it, there's many policy interventions we talk about a lot and that are being implemented in various places that are really about shaping the peer groups that kids are exposed to. So in the 70s, busing policies were exactly this, that you try to move kids from one school to another with the idea of making peer groups more even. Tracking policies in schools, so do you have students separated by skill and achievement or not, of course, shapes what the peer groups are. Big fights about this in Evanston schools all the time. School choice in general, do you have a tracked school system or not? Can people select into selective enrollment schools? All of these are questions that are very much central to who the peers of kids are going to be. Of course, you can then ask, well, is there some interaction of these policies with the actions that parents take in that same space? By the way, I should say it's the thing that is slightly awkward about presenting online is that you don't really see anybody while you're doing it. So if you have any questions, anything or clarification, please don't hesitate to jump in. I'm very glad to hear somebody in between while I'm talking. Okay, so here's a bit more specifically what we're going to do today. So step one is to develop a model. We're going to have a model of parenting where peer effects are going to play a central role. So there's going to be variation in the environments that kids grow up in, and these environments are characterized by the peers that are around children in that place. And then there's going to be a peer formation by kids, so that they choose who to be friends with, and there's going to be parenting decisions, and those two are going to be both relate to each other. So the kids are going to react to their parents, the parents are going to react to the kids. We're going to estimate this model with data on US teenagers from the EdHealth survey. I'll talk a bit more about the data in a second, but importantly in the data we have information both on what the parents do and what the peer groups are. So we have information on friendship networks, and we can really see how this shapes, how this turns out over time. And then finally, with the estimated model, we're going to address this policy question, where we're going to look in particular at the question of how interventions that try to move kids to a better peer group, how these scale. So if you take just one kid from maybe a low performing to a high performing school, what's the effect of that, and how do the effects change if you move more and more kids, if you scale up these interventions? Then we're going to see that one key insight from the study is going to be that scaling is actually going to depend quite a bit on parenting. So the more kids you send from one school to the other, the lower the effects are going to be. And for this deterioration in the outcomes, endogenous parenting is actually a very important determinant. So there's going to be a sense in which parents kind of push back against some of the integration that the policy is going to try to achieve. and this will have a quite sizable impact on the outcome. And that's important if you want to take, say, empirical results that are essentially about the effects of moving a single child. If you look at how they identified, if you want to take those to policy dimensions which are planned to be at a much bigger scale. Okay, literature. I won't talk a ton about literature. There's a lot of it. Generally speaking, the paper very much builds on the recent literature on skill formation. So Jim Hackman has many papers on this, but there's many other contributors. So it's a large literature where the primary focus is on estimating the technology for skill formation, to understand what are the mutual impacts of parents, of schools, of pre-existing skills. So how do these different factors come together to shape how skills evolve? That's going to be a key ingredient in our model too. The second part is that our paper is very much about peers and neighborhoods. Of course, there's a large recent literature also on this aspect, on the social environment and neighborhoods, and the impact of that on children. Again, many papers in this. Chad and Hendren, for example, have a couple of really well-known recent papers, but there's many others. Our co-author Francesco Agostinelli, his job market paper was also on the space, and so we built to some extent on his contribution. And then finally, we merge these literatures with our own work and related work on parenting style. So we use economic models to understand what general type of parenting parents engage. Okay, so that's introduction. I will now first talk about the data and give you some basic descriptive evidence, some basic facts that motivate the model that I'm going to develop later on. So we use the data from the AdHealth survey, which is a longitudinal study of kids in 144 public and private schools. And these schools are chosen to be representative for the United States in 1994. There's done an in-school survey with about 90,000 kids that are in grades 7 to 12. And importantly, for these kids, we observe their friendship network. So every kid is asked in every year, who are your 5 best male friends, who are your 5 best female friends, so we can see who they're friends with. We can also see how these friendship networks evolve from year to year as these kids pass through high school. So we're going to look only at high school kids in our study. We also know something about these kids, so we have a lot of information on the families, such as the income of the families, the education of the parents, and we also know performance measures. So we have GPA in core subjects, and we have also some achievement. And then finally, there's going to be an in-home survey for a subsample of these kids. Then we have measures of parental involvement. So for example, time that parents and kids spend together on education-oriented activities. So you can use this to get some traditional measure of parental investment in children's skills. But we also have measures of parenting style that we're going to focus on in our study. Now, here's the key question that this paper is going to revolve around. That's kind of new and hasn't been used, I think, in the existing literature, which is a question on intervening in peer formation. So the question is, and this is a question that's asked to the kids, do your parents let you make your own decisions about the people you hang around with? And you can say either yes or no. We're going to say that if the answer is no, so you cannot make your own decisions, that the parents are authoritarian about friends. This would be a parent that says, listen, those Doepke boys are bad news. You can't hang out with those. You have to choose some more promising friends for yourself. So if you have an attitude like that, we're going to call you authoritarian about friends. If you say yes, my parents let me make my own decisions, we're going to be just calling you non-authoritarian. So in the study, we have about 16% of parents that are authoritarian about friends, and we want to learn more about what determines the decision of on this parenting style, and we also want to know what are the consequences of this decision. Okay, so the model will have a lot of detail on this, but just at an intuitive level, what you might expect is that the decision of whether you want to intervene in your kids' friendship formation, well, depends on many things, but probably it will also depend on who those potential friends are. Now, if you're in a place where there's many kids that are, from your perspective as a parent, potentially a bad influence on your kids, where there's many bad apples, you might call them, well, then you might be more inclined to intervene. And if you look at the EdHealth data, the data is indeed suggestive of this being true. Here you see two plots of the fraction of authoritarian parents. It's a Bind scatter plot by family income and by inequality. So here in this first picture, here we have the median family income at the school in $10,000 per year. So $20,000 over here would be a very poor neighborhood. Over here it gets quite rich. And here we have the fraction of authoritarian parents in this in these different neighborhoods. So this would be schools and then binned into 20 bins. Here you see a very clear, very sharp negative relationship that it's the poor neighborhoods where there's many parents who intervene in friendship formation. It is the rich neighborhoods where that is much less common. So average income is important. You can also see that inequality is quite important. And this may be even more so than the average income goes with this idea that that exposure to potentially bad role models, to potentially problematic peers, is what motivates parents. So if you sort these schools by the inequality, we measure this here by the 90-10 percentile income ratio of families at the school, you see that in low inequality schools, only very few parents intervene in friendship formation, and the more unequal you get, the more common this gets. So just at a descriptive level, I think these relationships are suggestive of parents being more interventionist, more likely to intervene in friendship formation, essentially saying you can't hang out with certain people if there's a higher likelihood of potentially, in this case, poor or maybe low-performing kids being around. Now, of course, this is just a correlation, and with any correlation, you should be concerned, well, that it's maybe spurious, maybe there's something else that varies in the characteristics of parents across these schools. So you're going to want to look also what happens inside schools. You can do this with family income, but once you look inside schools, we think that perhaps what's even more important is the actual school accomplishment of the other kids. So the idea is going to be ultimately in our model that what the parents are really worried about is the accumulation of skills of their own kids. You want your kid to get good grades, to go off to college, do well, and so you might be worried about the school accomplishment of friends they hang out with. And so what we measure is the relationship between intervening or not in friendship formation with the school accomplishment of other kids that your kids are exposed to. Here we do this with school fixed effects. So we take out the variation across schools entirely, and so this regression is identified only by variation within a school across cohorts. Because even if you compare different cohorts in a given school, there's going to be some random variation in the average performance of different kids and in the variation of performance. So what we see here is essentially the same thing we saw before. So if you look at the mean GPA within a grade, within a school, that has a sizably negative impact on the probability of being authoritarian. So this is just a 0-1, whether or not you intervene in friendship formation. So higher GPA means fewer parents are going to intervene. If you look at inequality, so this is standard deviation of the GPA within the grade. So in school cohorts where there's a lot of inequality in grades, where there's more low-performing and more high-performing kids as opposed to everybody in the middle, you get a sizably larger number of parents intervening in friendship formation. Okay. Then you can put these things together. If you introduce additional family-level controls, you have school fixed effects, and put these two things together, the signs stay the same. But perhaps, as you might have expected, so if you put both of them in, the inequality is really what dominates. So heterogeneity in skills is what's the most predictive of intervening in friendship formation of your teenager. Now, quantitatively, these effects are actually quite substantial. So if you look at the effect of the mean GPA just in the single regressions, and you get a 0.1 point increase in average GPA on the usual 1 to 4 scale, gives you a 0.4 to 1.2% percentage point increase in the probability of being authoritarian. Keep in mind the baseline is 18%, so this is already quite significant. If you look at inequality, if you have a 0.1% increase in the standard deviation of GPA, you get a 2 to 3 percentage point increase in the probability of being authoritarian. So these things actually are quite large. they explain a significant fraction of variation in interventions in peer formation. Okay, so this is suggestive of why parents do this. That the impact of other peers on your own kids' skill formation is what motivates these parents. Of course, the next question is what is the actual result of the intervention? If you're now going to intervene, if you're going to tell your kids you can't hang out with the Doepke boys because they're maybe bad influence, what's going to be the impact of this on your kid for the future? So first of all, in the data you can see that the impact of this intervention on the peers is the way it is intended. So if a parent is authoritarian today, meaning says you cannot pick your friends freely, we see in the next period it's going to be a positive effect on the average GPA of peers that your kid is going to have. So the parents do seem to succeed in getting better peers for their kids, or maybe blocking somebody who was not very desirable from their perspective. I should say that these regressions, I think more so than the other ones before, are of course, these are correlations. These are not causal regressions. And this is very much a concern here because there's very good reasons to think that there could be selection. For example, if you as a parent know something about, say, your own kid's tendency to befriend one peer or the other, you would think that if you have more reason to be worried about who your own kid wants to hang out with, that would be more interventionist, but that would actually work against finding an effect here. So these are, I think, data moments, they're correlations. You shouldn't think of these as causal, but it's encouraging to see that they go in the direction that you would expect. So you have a positive impact on GPA of peers, and you also, on average, have a positive impact on the GPA of your own kid, perhaps through the impact of peers. Okay, so that is suggestive evidence. So these are correlations in the data that are suggestive of this rational motive of intervention in peer groups being there. Of course, these are correlations, so we want to model this to understand this relationship better, and we also want to have a model to ultimately be able to do a policy analysis, because ultimately our interest is going to be to see what this parenting behavior implies for other interventions in peer groups. Now, this model of parenting we're going to have here is essentially taking the perspective of our earlier work on parenting, where we have parents and children interacting, and we have parents having both altruistic and paternalistic motives in evaluating the utility of their kids. They do like their kids, but they have maybe somewhat different priorities, maybe a higher priority on accumulating skills as opposed to just enjoying hanging around with friends. So we have a model that's populated by parents and children. It's a model about the high school years. We're going to track these parents and children over the 4 years of high school. What varies initially is just child skills. So we're going to have heterogeneity in skills. This is going to also vary across neighborhoods. So these people are going to be grouped into different subgroups, different schools or neighborhoods, you might call them, that are characterized by a given group of kids with given skills being around. Parents make two decisions. They decide on the intervention in friendship, so this authoritarian versus non-authoritarian parenting style. And they also have a second dimension, kind of a more traditional parenting choice of investing in the kids' skills, what we call authoritative time investment, so kind of a continuous choice of how much you want to push them to invest in skills. This is like sitting down with them to do homework or making sure they actually do it. The children also make decisions, but in this model, they primarily decide on who to be friends. So they can decide who their peer group is going to be. They're going to do this taking as given the parent's behavior. So the choice of the parent on parenting style is going to be some determinant of what the friendships are going to be. So here's the timeline of the model. So we enter period T. Theta is the notation for skills. So theta IT is the individual state variable for the kid in this period. There's also the existing peers. So theta bar is a summary statistic of the quality of the peers that this kid is exposed to. It's we're going to essentially use the average of GPA. You could do other summary statistics. Okay, so we have given skills, given peer skills, and then first the parent makes a couple of decisions. The parent decides on parenting style, so whether or not to intervene in this formation of peer groups in the future, and also decides on investments, so how much time to spend on trying to push the kid to work harder, to get better grades and get a higher GPA. So this is what happens first. Based on these decisions, so based on the existing skills, peer skills, and these investments, the child's skills are realized for the next period. So theta IT plus 1 is the essentially the GPA at the end of a year in high school, at the beginning of the next year in high school. At this point, the kid is going to now make a new round of friendship decisions, so decide who to hang out with, and that determines the next peer group, theta bar IT plus 1. And these two things together then become the state variable in the next period. This is repeated 4 times, 4 years of high school, then they go off to college, where the final skills of the kid is what determines that final year. Now here's the technology for skill formation, so how skills evolve over time. And so this is essentially a version of a typical CS technology used in much of the literature, but with an additional input of parenting style. So the basic idea is that skills in the next period, theta IT plus 1, this is measured by GPA, is a function of some overall productivity term, and then a CS function in 3 things. The own skills of the child, so theta I is your own skills. Then it's a theta bar, so it's the skills of your peers. So there's some rubbing off of peer skills on your own skills. And then finally the investment I, which is the time that your parents spend on pushing you to study and work hard. Okay? And it's CS, so there's a flexibility in estimating the elasticity of substitution between these different factors. So this is not with parenting style yet, so then we enter the parenting style. So this parenting style is 0-1, where 0 means you don't intervene and 1 means you intervene in friendship formation. So PIT equals 1 means that you are an authoritarian parent. And we allow this parenting style to affect the technology for skill formation. First of all, we allow productivity to vary, and we also allow, in principle, the substitution relationships between these different factors of production to vary. Okay. Now, why would you assume that the technology depends on the parenting style? So the idea here is that if you are an authoritarian parent, well, you might undermine to some extent your ability to influence your child in other ways. If I'm going to really come down hard on my child and say, no, you can't hang out with those guys, you can hang out with these guys, you can only be friends with these really great, wonderful kids that I like, well, maybe you have some disruptive influence on your overall relationship. So maybe at that point, your kid will listen less to you in other dimensions. It might be harder for you now to intervene in other ways. And so the productivity impact here will capture this, that maybe your overall productivity in producing skills will go down. Maybe also the impact that you have in terms of influencing your child through investment will go lower or take a different form. Once we estimate this model, the estimate is actually very suggestive that the technology does change quite substantially based on whether or not you intervene. That's why we want to have this flexibility. In the end, the main results don't really hinge on this, but this the data kind of really wants this relationship to be. Okay, so that is the technology for skill formation. Let's now go to people's choices, starting with the children. Our children here are going to care primarily about friendship. So there's a value function for kids. The BNT is the value function of this child in period T, and depends on the child's own skills and on the peer skills in this period, same state variables as for the parent. And this utility is going to be defined over 2 things. It's defined over a utility of friendships, so FIT plus 1. Is the friendships you're going to form in period T for period T plus 1. This is when you enjoy them. And then discounted utility from the future, where these skills are ultimately going to show up. And the skills are state variables, both because skills are something you care about ultimately, but also because the skills that you and your peers have an impact on what your utility from friendship formation is going to be. Now, in our actual estimated model, we're going to set B to 0. So these kids are going to be myopic, just care about friendships and nothing else. It doesn't really matter that much, but that makes estimation a bit easier. I can talk more about that later if you have questions. All right, so let's focus on the friendship part. So the utility of a potential friendship, so Fij t plus 1, that's the utility that this kid I would get from being friends with kid J. Okay, so it's just some number, and it's a function that depends on your own skills, the other kid's skills, on the parenting style, and then a random shock. And so this is ultimately a random utility model in information of friendships. So these numbers are defined for any possible combination of I and J, and there's going to be a friendship formed if both of these kids agree. So the value of no friendship is normalized to 0. So a friendship is formed if both kid I wants to be friends with kid J, and conversely, if kid J wants to be friends with kid I. And so if those two things are both satisfied, then a friendship forms. I should say, by the way, that the fact that you need both kids to agree, that you need mutual agreement for friendship, already implies that there's going to be externalities here. Now, if I forbid my kid I to play with J, well, then J can't be friends with I, and so it's going to be spill over to that other family. And that's going to be important if you ultimately want to think about social efficiency or potential externalities playing a role in these kind of models. Okay, so the kids are going to look at all these possible friendships. If there's a friendship possible, they're going to form it, and then the total friendship utility is just the sum of all the friendships that you form. So this Fit plus 1 is the thing that goes in the utility function here. This, in fact, is going to be linear. So this is the ultimate utility you're going to get out of your friendships. Now, what does this actually look like? So here's what in the estimated model friendship utility looks like. The functional form for the utility that kid I gets from being friends with kid J. It's going to be log linear. There's a term in my own skill, so there's the possibility that, say, higher GPA kids are maybe more or maybe less gregarious and interested in being friends in general. There's some impact of the skill of the other child. Now, as I guess a nerd myself, I kind of thought gamma 2 would be positive, that you kind of want to be friends with the high GPA kids. Of course, in the data, that's not true at all. In the data, you'll see that gamma 2 is negative and actually quite large. The high GPA kids are not cool. So there's definitely some downward impact here, which may be only one reason why the parents might be worried about this. But you care not only about the overall skill of the other kids. Very importantly, you care also about how distant you are. So this term over here, gamma 3, and this is the difference between your own skill and your other skill. This term over here captures the possibility of homophily bias, so essentially the tendency to befriend kids that are similar to yourself. And this term is quite important. So in the data, it's very clear that friendships are formed often with kids that are kind of similar in skill, and so this is going to be one of the important determinants of friendship. Okay, so these three things is what the kid cares about naturally. And then there's the intervention. So this last term over here is what the intervention of the parent does to utility from friendship. The idea here is what the parent is trying to do is to encourage you to be friends with higher skill peers, or conversely, it wants to discourage friendships with lower skill peers. So the way we did this here is by punishing lower skill peer friendships. So here you have PI, this is 0 or 1. And this is an indicator variable which says, well, I'm going to put some pressure on you if the skill of this potential friend, J, is lower than your own skill. Okay? So there's going to be some pressure applied. This pressure is going to be increasing in the distance between your own skill and this other kid's skills. Okay? So the lower the skill of the potential peer, the larger the penalty applied by the parent. So the idea is, the parent cannot really directly forbid the friendship. It's not infinity, this term. But you can put some pressure. You can say, well, don't do this. If you bring this other kid home, I turned the Wi-Fi off. Whatever you want to do, you can put some punishment scheme in place to discourage this friendship. And we're ultimately going to measure, how strong this is, because we observe the P. We observe whether parents or not are interventionists, and the model will give us some answer of how effective parents actually are doing this. Okay, so that was the kids part of the choice problem, just the choice of who you want to be friends with. Let's move to the parents. The parents decide on two things. They decide on the parenting style, so whether or not to intervene, and they decide on these investments in skills. What do they care about? So they have a value function that's also a function of the same state variables. But the N over here, by the way, denotes neighborhood, because these value functions differ depending on which neighborhood you live in, because they have a different peer group that you draw from, and that determines the friendship utility. Now, what is this value function? Well, our parents are going to care, first of all, about themselves. So there's some utility from these various choices, essentially a cost of investing in skills, the cost of being authoritarian, and some random draws also that give us some heterogeneity in these choices. And then you care about your kid. And the way you care about your kid is through both altruism and paternalism. So this part over here, z times 1 minus lambda, is the weight on altruism. So this is the degree to which you actually enjoy the utility of your child. So these parents aren't terrible. They actually do appreciate that you as a teenager have fun, that you have enjoyment out of friendships, and this is a part of what it is your utility. But it's not the only thing. There's a second thing, which is the paternalistic part, which is that you have your own evaluation of what the kid is doing, which in this particular application is essentially based on the skill of the kid. So the parent, in a sense, cares more about skill accumulation on the margin. The parent would like the kid to care more about school, maybe a little bit less about friends. And so this paternalistic part is what creates this conflict and this possibility of intervention. From the child's perspective, being authoritarian, of course, is only a negative term utility. It doesn't increase the child's utility, but because the parent cares about the skills, well, maybe the parent still wants to do this. These are the two ways in which the kids enter utility, and then there's the continuation utility, because we go through these 4 years of high school. There's finally a continuation utility at the end of high school, which depends on the ultimate. Okay, so that's what the parent does. And then it will do this, in the optimal way. That is essentially the structure that we're going to take to the data. So now we're going to estimate this model to see how well it can account for the. The method of estimation is similar to the method of moments. We're doing is indirect inference, where the moments are essentially regressions, some of which I've already shown. So we're looking for regression coefficients of parenting style on child skills and peer skills. I've mentioned those before. So, for example, this a result that if there's more inequality in peer skills, that parenting style will be more authoritarian. We make these regressions in the data, and then we do the same regressions in the model, and we match the coefficients. We do regressions of the evolution of skills, so next period skills for the kid, on the child's own skills and peer skills. We do regressions of peer quality on child skills and peer skills. And then we also do investments, so these time investments on child skills and peer skills. We do this separately by parenting style. And so the difference is here, how the investments in skills depend on parenting style. This is what's an important determinant of the estimation of the technology of skill formation. And this is the data here suggests that the technology is quite different for these authoritarian and non-authoritarian parents. And there's a few additional moments. So there's a bunch of regressions taken from the data, and this is what the matches. And we do this by you have to define neighborhoods to do this estimation. We can't quite handle 144 as many schools as there in the data. So what we do is to form 4 neighborhoods in our model that are essentially matched to quantiles of the skill distribution in the data. So we take the 25% of schools with the lowest average GPA. We take moments from those schools. And this is essentially our neighborhood number 1. And we do this again for the other quartiles of the skill distribution. And that gives us a distribution of neighborhoods in the model, and that is the basis then for the estimate. Now, one thing we didn't do in the estimation is to use the evidence on variation across neighborhoods, because all of these regressions we use have school fixed effects, so we don't really pick up any of the broad variation. So one thing you can do for looking at the fit of the model for untargeted moments is to look at variation across neighborhoods. And let me just show you maybe that picture. So here's actually what the model versus data implies for the variation in parenting styles across neighborhoods as opposed to within, which drives the estimation. Here's our 4 neighborhoods, the neighborhood 1, 2, 3, 4, where neighborhood 1 is matched to the 25% of schools with the lowest GPA all the way to the highest. And here you have the fraction of authoritarian parents in all of these neighborhoods in the data, which, as we saw at the beginning, kind of goes down very sharply. So the higher skill the school, therefore also the richer the neighborhood, the lower the fraction of authoritarian parents. You see that actually the estimated model, even though it doesn't target this, gives you essentially the same variation. It's not a ton of time, but I get to tell you in a bit more detail, maybe in the discussion, what it is about the technology of skill formation that gives you this strong negative impact. Essentially, there's a sense in which the technology estimates say that being authoritarian is more costly if you want to invest a lot in skills. So there's a sense in which being authoritarian makes it more difficult to invest in skills in another way. If you want to invest a lot, as you want to do if your kid has very high skills, that makes the authoritarian style less attractive, and that explains this relationship. Okay, so that is what I was going to say about estimation. Let me take a look at the time. I can tell you some details on the estimation. So in the technology, one thing we estimate is that the substitution relationship between different inputs depends on the parenting style. So if you have the authoritarian parenting style, so P equals 1, you intervene in friendship formation, there we estimate that the coefficients are actually very close to Cobb-Douglas. So the substitution is 1 between these different inputs. We also see that the impact of choosing P equals 1 on the productivity is actually down. So the productivity of skill formation falls. And this already gives you a bit of the trade-off that you're going to face. So if you intervene, you have a low productivity of skill accumulation, which means you really only intervene if it's really necessary to do so. If the potential skill exposure is so negative that it would outweigh this direct negative impact. And so you have so a parent who intervenes is going to have a negative impact to the technology that's ultimately offset by a positive impact through better peer selection. For the non-authoritarian parents, so who do not intervene in friendship formation, then we see that child quality and other inputs are complements, and we see that peers and parents are substitutes. And so in an environment where the peers are very strong, there's in a sense less need to invest a lot in this investment yourself, because you can free ride to some extent on the influence from the peers. In a low peer environment, you want to invest more to kind of offset this influence. Peer formation. So there's going to be a negative coefficient on peer skills. As I mentioned, the high GPA kids are not cool. It's the low GPA kids that are more attractive as friends. But importantly, there's homophily bias. So kids do want to be friends with others who are similar to themselves. And we also see that the authoritarian parenting style is quite effective. So the estimated model suggests that if you intervene in friendship formation, the probability that your kid will be friends with a kid that's 1 standard deviation below the mean of skills, it goes down by 35%. So it's a quite sizable impact on the probability of forming links with low skill peers. The trade-off, I've already talked a bit about this. So what is the trade-off that parents face when they think about authoritarian parenting? So the upside is, as we just saw on the previous slide, is that being authoritarian has a quite sizable impact on peer selection. The average skill of peers that your kid is going to pick up is going to improve quite substantially. And because peers matter a lot in the technology for skill formation, it also gives you a positive impact on your own kids' skills in the future. At the same time, there's this direct impact on the productivity of skill formation that goes down, so you have to kind of weigh those things against each other. The second term is always there. The reduction in productivity is inescapable, but the improvement in peer selection, that of course hinges on what the peer environment is. Now, if the peers are completely homogeneous, there's no improvement whatsoever because there are no peers that are of lower quality. But if there's a high heterogeneity, this effect becomes much more important. This is why the model reproduces that relationship that in highly unequal neighborhoods with a lot of variation in skills, that you get a lot more intervention in peer formation. If you go to the question of when authoritarian parenting is more attractive, you first of all have this impact on this relationship with the peer environment. So if there's a high probability of befriending low-skill peers, you want to do this. There's also a relationship with the own skills of the peer. This has to do with the complementarity in the production function between the own skill of your child and your investment. So if you have a child that has relatively low skill, you don't want to invest as much, and therefore the kind of downside of being authoritarian isn't that high. Whereas if you have a very high skilled child, it's very effective to invest on your own. And by being authoritarian, you undercut that, and so there's also a relationship with that. So both of these relationships essentially tell you that parents in poor neighborhoods would be more likely to intervene, which of course is what we already saw in the data at the beginning. Okay, last thing I want to do is policy analysis. So I now want to ask, well, what does this model imply for the effects of policy intervention? The intervention I'm going to think about here is moving children to a better environment, something that's similar to a busing policy like in the old days, where you just move kids from one neighborhood to the other. We're going to, in our model, move kids from neighborhood 2, kind of the 25 to 50th percentile of skill, to neighborhood 4, which is the richest neighborhood, also the highest quartile in our data. So this in the data corresponds to median family income of 48,000 to 102,000 in the Chicago area. If you know this place, this is a bit like moving a kid from Waukegan, which is just on the border with Wisconsin, so kind of not really poor, but kind of lower income town in Illinois, to Evanston, not super rich, but certainly a lot wealthier than Waukegan. And so what are the effects of moving kids from this one neighborhood to the other, taking into account what the different skill environments are? We're going to first of all ask what's the effect on a single child, but then importantly, how does this scale up? So if you move more and more kids, how is the intervention going to change? And how does this depend on what the parents do? How important is the response of parents to this changed policy? So let me first tell you what the behavioral responses are, and then show you in pictures what the overall impact is. What's the impact on moved children? So if you move children, of course, you affect their friendship formation. When you move a single child, it almost has no choice but to be friends with some of the kids already there. But what you see is as you scale up the policy, you're going to have essentially arising a segregation within the new school. So think of a policy where you move a bunch of kids from a poor school to a rich school, because in the model, kids have a tendency to be friends with others who are similar to themselves. There's a homophily bias. Over time, these new kids are increasingly going to form their own peer group. They're going to be friends with each other. So this homophily bias is going to lead to segregation inside the new school. And this is one reason why, as you move up the policy, the effectiveness is going to go. Now you can also look at the reaction of parents, and there's two types of parents to consider: the parents of the kids who are being moved, but also the parents of the kids at the school that's receiving those kids, because they also matter. Because if they are, for example, authoritarian, well, it's going to be harder for the new kids to be friends with the kids already there. If you look at the parents of the moved kids, you see that they're going to be less likely to be authoritarian, because this depends on the peer group, and the peer group is better at the new school. So there's going to be an effect here, which is in principle a positive effect, because authoritarian parenting by itself doesn't really have a very beneficial impact. There's also the second dimension of parenting, and here the effect is actually downward, because you have a complementarity between substitutability between peer quality and investment. So in this higher quality environment, the parents are going to kind of step back a little bit and free ride on these higher quality peers. So the investment is going to go down a little. And if you look at the receiving parents, what do the parents in Evanston, in this example, are going to do? Well, you're going to see that as the policy is scaled up, you're going to have more and more of these parents going to be authoritarian. And so they're going to, from their perspective, observe a deterioration in the quality of the peer group. More low-skill peers are coming in, and that's going to make those parents more likely to intervene. And that is, from their perspective, protecting their own kids from bad influences. Of course, from the perspective of the moved families, that's a negative impact because it makes it now difficult to have these kids at the existing school as friends, and reduces the peer spillovers from one group to the other. Here we can see how these effects turn out overall. So this is a picture of the mean impact on logged skills of the moved kids. So what's the improvement in skills of one of these kids moved from Waukegan to Evanston as a function of the number of kids moved, here varying from 0 to 40. I should say a school in our model has about 200 kids. I should say a cohort in the school has about 200 kids. So we're going here from essentially a 0 to about 20% of the cohort being these. And here you see that that these effects are quite strongly declining as you scale up this intervention. So it goes from 20%, 20 log point improvement in skills to just about half as much as you go from 0 to 20%. So some of this deterioration, of course, is just a dilution effect. As you move more and more skills, you just mechanically lower the quality of the average peer at this new school. But you can then break down things and kind of ask, well, how much of this scaling is due to parent interventions as opposed to what is just a straight dilution effect. So here are some pictures that show you how important parenting is for these effects. So the blue lines that we saw before, the effect go from 20% to 10%. The red line over here shows you what the intervention would have been like if we keep parents' behavior fixed at the previous level. So we essentially force parents to adopt the parenting style and the investments that would have done if the kids had never been moved at all. What you see here is if you have the moving parents fix the behavior, in fact, you would have gotten even larger improvement in skill. And so this difference between these two lines over here, this is due to the endogeneity of the investment choice, of how much you want to push your kids to work hard in school. But this choice is substitutable with peer quality. So what happens if you move kids to this new school, because this peer environment is now better and is a substitute for your own investment, the kids, the parents are going to relax more, they're going to invest less. This explains this impact over here. This essentially is parents becoming more relaxed in the new environment and therefore having a smaller impact. This becomes smaller, of course, as you go to a higher scaling, because then the improvement in the peer group is no longer as good. But now, more importantly, here is the impact on the receiving parents. So here we have in blue, this is the impact on the skills of the kids at the school that is receiving those children as a function of the scale. This is a negative effect because the more kids you move, the worse the skill group becomes compared to before. And so the skills of the Evanston kids in this example are going to fall by about, 7% at the highest scale. The red line over here shows you what the impact would have been if you had held parental behavior fixed. And so you see that if you held the parental behavior fixed, you would have gotten a much larger decline in skills the higher the intervention. And so the difference between these two lines is now due to something the parents do to compensate for this change, and a large part of this is being more authoritarian. And so as we move towards more children being moved, we find that more and more of those parents from the higher income district, from the better school, are authoritarian. They essentially tell their kids not to hang out with those new children that just arrived. And that is, from their perspective, efficient, because it lowers some of that skill loss. Of course, there's going to be a spillover because not being friends with those other kids removes the positive peer effects from those kids. So it makes the advantage of moving to the new school for those moved kids a lot smaller than it would have been otherwise. So essentially, we see here endogenous segregation that the families respond in a way that makes these gains a lot more elusive compared to what they look like if you just have the experiment of moving a single child, which is what empirical work often identifies. You can also do other experiments, such as just reducing inequality overall. I won't go through the details because I'm out of time. I just want to say that one thing you find there is that you can really see that inequality within neighborhoods is very important. For example, one thing we considered here is to remove all segregation, essentially keep everybody's income and skills the same, but put everybody in the same school district. A school district is fully integrated, but also it's very highly unequal because there's no very high variation inside the school district. You can actually see that this integration experiment where you keep inequality the same, you just put everybody together, in fact, gives you worse outcomes because of this kind of detrimental income of inequality within neighborhoods. And you can break this down a bit more to think what this means potentially for policy. But I want to stop here. So what did we do? Well, we looked at some new data of how parenting in terms of peer formation depends on the economic environment. The first conclusion, I think, from this work is that an economic model, so a model where we think of parents as being purposeful and broadly rational in their decisions on how they parent, actually fits this evidence quite well. So an economic model is able to account for the observed interaction between the social environment, in terms of inequality, in terms of peer groups, the peer formation of the kids, and the parenting interventions that the parents decide to take. That's kind of encouraging. It's also important because there's policy implications that follow from this. There's many policies we nowadays consider that have to do with integration, with shaping peer groups, with how we should have schools. And one important observation, I think, here is that gains from these policies can be elusive because if you scale them up, the parents might be pushing back against what the policy is trying to achieve. And ultimately, this implies if you want to have an effective policy, taking the behavioral responses of children and parents into account is going to be an important step in identifying promising policy. That's what I wanted to tell you today about. I would be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthias. That was a fantastic presentation. At this point, if you're participating, you can add your comments to the chat, and then our moderator, which is not me, will aggregate those questions and ask them to Matthias.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to clarify, this is Steph. I am one of the moderators. Instead of adding your questions to the chat, if you could please add them to the Q&A. There is a distinction, so if you could please put them in the Q&A, we would appreciate that. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, this is Teresa, also one of the moderators. Before we get questions from our attendees, I was going to start myself and ask a question. First, thanks, Matthias. It was really, really interesting. And I was going to ask a question. You talked about parents choosing or influencing fears of their kids as to influence their human capital accumulation, essentially. And I was going to ask whether you also considered or thought in your model to how this would influence the partnering choices of the kids, or whether this is something the parents would take into account, or whether your data has anything to say about that. I was thinking that especially because you have data on teenagers in high school, which sounds to me like the time where this could be going on, and some of the adverse outcomes could have to do with maybe early partnering, getting pregnant.
It's a great question. I don't know the answer. So I don't believe we have data on this relationship, but we might. So I will have to get back to you on this, because I agree it would be interesting to do to see if the same question
that's very interesting, because you said that you have data on who is friends with whom. So maybe in that we could see something about who is friends with whom in terms of more than friends. But that would be really interesting.
Yes. So I'll look it up. Yes.
Thank you. One more question, if I may. So I definitely found it interesting and identify with the idea that the effect of peers' GPA is in fact different than the parents might wish. That kids wish to socialize with peers that are not the nerds. And it seems that this creates a clear conflict between the child and the parent. So I was wondering, first of all, what does it mean in your estimates? Do you see that parents are really altruistic or not at all? Because this seems to matter for that, right?
Yes, yeah, and in fact, the estimates do suggest that that there's quite a bit of conflict. You know? So for intervention to really happen, you have to have the paternalistic part where you care about the skill and not so much about the friendship to be quite strong. And that is essentially because there's if you think about the total cost of intervening, it is costly both for the parent and for the child. You know, so you have the direct negative impact on skill formation. There's also just the cost for the parent, you know, the utility cost of intervening in this, but also the impact on the utility for the child is quite significant. You know? So the kids don't really want to be pushed towards a lower utility. You know? And so you kind of have to, the model has to find a way to discount that disutility for the child. And the way to do this is to make the paternalistic component quite strong. And that's something we have found in other work too. You know, so that there's certainly evidence that parents care about the direct utility of their kids, but you know, to really explain why you have so much conflict, you can't really have them care all that much.
Yeah, great. So we have some questions. I'm going to let Steph take over and ask you, but you can also, I think, read them on your screen if you want it.
Okay, so let me read the first question here. The productivity factor in your model. Let's see. Oh, I know. I see it starts. Okay. There's some evidence that high temperature and pollution affect students' performance. On days of heat waves, there's evidence that kids perform poorly in math exams, but the effects seem to decrease as a response to longer-run changes in climate. Would these environmental amenities affect the productivity factor in your model? If so, would they affect parental style and investment? Would that one potential reason why kids adjust their effort to perform better in the long run? Okay, so well, it really depends on you know, where this effect is going to show up. You know, so if you just had a proportional shift in overall productivity, it doesn't really affect much the trade-off between the one and the other. At the end of the day, this is kind of most of the model is in logs. So if you just have a proportional shift of overall productivity, trade-offs don't change a lot. Of course, it's different if there is impacts on the substitution relationships. So for example, if the effect of pollution, you know, would make it hard to think and maybe parental investment more efficient, then it could work out in a different way. But I don't think we have good information on this so far. There's a new question here, which is on information about drug-related behavior. And so the question of whether this issue of drugs is potentially important in trying to influence peers, and drug use could be high in both high and low income schools, but potentially different drugs. And it's something I kind of very much agree with. We have started to explore this. So because intuitively you would think that you know, when I influence my kids' peer groups, yes, I do care about GPA, but you might think that often parents have a lot more tangible things to be worried about. You know, so drugs, I think, is a very good example. Also crime. You know, if you think of really bad neighborhoods, you know, the possibility that your kids could get into contact with maybe gangs, for example, would be maybe a much more urgent concern than just GPA. We do have information on some of these factors, so drug use and crime. It's a bit harder for estimation because these things are not you know, as continuously measured, and they're kind of, you know, many don't really report much of anything. So it's a little bit harder to pin down with an estimated model. But intuitively, I think these things are very important. I think as we get maybe, hopefully at some point, bigger data sets, figuring out how these different dimensions of just school performance versus kind of major risks you're exposed to as a teenager, how these different dimensions interact in shaping peer formation, I think it will be very important to do. Okay, let's see. Next question is, could you do a policy simulation that we move children by skill quartile, not income quartile? Are you going to help children with low skill improve their skills by moving them to a better school? Yes, we could definitely do that. We haven't done that. We have done some other interventions. So one thing we have, for example, looked at is at a policy where maybe through like tutoring or something like that, you kind of in a targeted way improve the skills of the lowest performing kids in a particular school. So you don't really move them, but it's a bit similar to that because you do an intervention particularly at the bottom of the skill distribution. And in our model, generally those policies are quite effective because by moving the skills of the lowest performing kids, you lower inequality in performance in the school. So there's going to be less intervention from parents in general, which has beneficial effects because of these spillovers across parents. Also because of the homophily bias, because you put kids closer together, you're going to get more spillovers because they're more likely to be friends. So generally speaking, interventions that focus on the lower end of the skill distribution are quite effective in this kind of model. Another question from Town O is, in the parent's value function, should the parameter of altruism of children's utility from choosing friends also include the possible disutility children will face if they freely choose friends? Disutility, not sure if I understand this question. Yes, I mean, essentially what the model does is include the full utility of the children, just as only one component that the parent cares about. Certainly, everything the child experiences does enter the parent's decision problem. If the child has this utility from the parent intervention, that does show up. It's not receiving as much weight as some of the other factors. Another question. I wonder if non-cognitive skills of children could be considered. Forming a peer group could be related to children's non-cognitive skills as well as grades. And yes, again, I agree with that. Especially when we think of earlier childhood education, that non-cognitive skills are quite important. And so I think it's a very good question if what we're picking up here is really about just the GPA. You might think, well, it's not really the GPA, it's because maybe GPA is correlated with things like being responsible and conscientious and patient, to kind of more general life skills that you want your kids to have that are maybe more transferable from one kid to the other than just academic achievement. So I think it's quite possible that a lot of this transmission that's going on is also about non-cognitive skills, and that just because all these things correlate, our GPA is kind of a summary measure of something broader. In our data set, we don't measure those other things in a very continuous year-by-year way. It's kind of hard to do an estimation based on them in this data set, but fundamentally, I think this is a very, very reasonable possibility. There's one more question. Jacqueline's asking, have you looked at diversity or inequality other than income, racial, ethnic, and immigrant status? We're in the process of doing that, and it's again, we wanted to focus on kind of the most straightforward thing first. If you do that, I mean, you do find a lot of homophily bias also in these other dimensions. For example, especially if you do racial diversity, then you also find a lot of grouping by race along the same lines that we have seen here. It is so it is definitely something that shapes the data. Of course, race is not subject to parental intervention, so there is in a sense less interaction with parenting, but it's something in the data, and so something I think would be worthwhile considering. I think those are the questions. I think we are also out of time. So thank you everybody for being here. This was fun, and I'm looking forward to seeing the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much, Matthias. We are grateful that you called in today and that you're with us. This, everyone, will be our break, but you could go to our schedule. It's on the H2D2 website, and also click on the other links to join other events just like this. Thank you so much for participating, and we'll see you in the other sessions today.
Thank you.